always found that it's common courtesy to alert someone when you hit record on a
All
piece of
right.
tech.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That way you don't catch them off guard. But uh, how? I hope you had a nice drive over. Everything was nice and smooth, I'm assuming.
Oh, yes, yes. Sydney is turning a very Mad Max-ish in that it looks very apocalyptic. We've got bushfires,
Oh my
and
gosh.
and the city is shrouded in smoke. And every day the sun is a red sun at all right through the day. So it's a little disturbing because we have like a lot of places climate denying basically politicians and yet it's happening right in front of our eyes and not just anecdotally but obviously the statistics are very very clear. But anyway, that's how it is. So Sydney, which is a very beautiful city, but right now it looks like the end of Thunderdome. It really does.
I have to say, I love that you've got a Thunderdome poster right behind you, because right
Oh,
behind me on the
yes.
wall, let me tweak my camera here. Um, right behind me, I've got
Oh,
my
right.
Laserdisc copy of Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome hanging below the Laserdisc copy of Road Warrior. That was sent to me by someone that we had on as a guest on the podcast. They had
Ah,
them lying around and they said, Rick, I imagine
yeah,
you'd want to have these. And I was like,
yeah,
you're dang tootin' I would.
yes. Yeah, well, this happens to be Doug Mitchell's office, but it's the quietest office. So, but he's got that there, yeah. But look, I've got to say, how much I not only enjoy your podcast, what you and Julia are doing. I'm very, I'm very honoured, really, just to see that how much understanding you have of the film. I mean, it's a way for me to go back and revisit all the work we did and see it through your eyes and say, yes, my God, we got most of most of your reading of the film is surprisingly accurate, and that's a big delight for me because this is a film told on the run.
Mm-hmm.
You've got basically 100 and whatever 14 minutes of story, and it's on the run. And one of the big risks of it was going to be very hard to understand. We couldn't really guess how much the audience was going to apprehend on the way. We couldn't stop for exposition. And one of the big pleasures of the movie, the response to the movie, has been that people read a lot of the subtext, a lot of the allegory underneath it, and I think that's why it's sticking around somewhat in people's minds, which is I've got to say it's very gratifying when that's your basic job to try to do that. Anyway, look, I'm very grateful. I've so much enjoyed listening to your podcast. And it's really odd, isn't it, when you when you're sort of listening to a podcast to tell you what people think about your film in such minute detail and Herculean task. I mean, what drove you to do it? I'm really interested to know.
Well, admittedly, I was a bit inspired by two guys named Pete and Alex who have been doing this format of podcast with the Star Wars movies for several years now.
Yeah.
They got inspired to do it by a couple of guys that were watching The Big Lebowski 1 minute at a time, but obviously Star Wars caught up in a way that The Big Lebowski never really could. And
Right.
so several years down the road, I wanted to get into the game. And I thought, well, what is the one series that every time it was on in reruns on a Saturday or Sunday, what is the one series I always wanted to watch? And it was Mad Max. And it was the same thing for Julia. She loves Beyond Thunderdome. And I got to say, I really liked the movie. After going through it 1 minute at a time, I love it even more. it's really hard to look at the series in retrospect and pick out one that is like the least out of the list. I mean, we have to list things because
Yeah.
it's the internet, but it's really hard to find one that I like the least. But the opportunity arose for us to take a look at it 1 minute at a time. And I was like, oh, we've got to do it with this series, just because, I mean, I've read so many things about your process and the things that you put your actors through as far as drumming up these backstories. And how could we not give that its proper due?
Yeah. Well, that's it. Well, that's again. I'm really grateful for it. You know, when Mark Sexton, who did the storyboards on the film, he when he mentioned it, he said, "Oh, take a listen." And I listened to it. And I thought, "Oh, what can I learn? I'm not going to learn anything new. I'm just going to get the same stuff back that I've been hearing." But I found myself getting quite addicted. It's a little bit, I don't know how to describe it. It's a little bit like, look, just to make it really clear, and you'll hear this from just about every filmmaker, you never go back. Once it's done, you can't go back and look at the film. And that's been my history. I've read it about Hitchcock, I've read it about everybody. With the moment the film's done, it's done. And I always found it very difficult to go back and watch films that I've made, unless a decade had passed, because basically there's nothing else you can do. You put so much of yourself into the film, you're kind of spent at the end of the process. And most of all, I think you're confronted with the things that maybe didn't work very well. And you've learned that anyway. You know that in the process of the movie. So you hope that you can sort of that your craft can improve in the next one way or the other. But this experience has been very, very unusual because it was I learned a lot about not only this particular movie, but about the process. It confirmed to me in a way that before podcasts or that couldn't quite have been done in that way. It confirmed to me that we read films not just on the surface, but we're picking up stuff as we go. We're interpreting the film on the run. It's kind of like speed read. We speed read movies today compared to what it would have been, a couple of decades or half a century ago. We actually are able to do that, and I'm just astonished by how much how much is picked up. I mean, Julia she's able to read so much stuff into it, and it's accurate. I have to go through details. But I would say it's 95 up to 99% accurate. The assumptions that are made are really, really. I'm really surprised. It's like I'm thinking. Anyway, that's enough of that.
I will gladly take that assessment, because I know we've come up with some real, what's a good way to say this, off the wall and really oddball assumptions. Like back when we got to the end of Thunderdome and suddenly we're having that amazing miniature shot flying through Sydney Harbor, and I raised the question, what happened to the ocean? And that just spiraled out into all sorts of malarkey. But I bring that up because I wanted to get into a lot of the questions that I sent ahead
Sure.
to Rachel. And with arguably all of the final three movies, because that first 1979 one, there's a lot of grass, there's a lot of green in that movie, and there's actually, if I remember right, a surprising amount of green in Road Warrior, but I digress. We've seen a lot of red dirt, Australian outback in these movies, and thankfully there was the crack in the earth in Thunderdome. But where Fury Road was so brown. And I know you don't like to talk about movies before they're done, but
Sure.
uh, is there an environment or a setting that you would like Max to visit? For example, maybe him driving through a dried out coral reef like they did in the Avalanche game.
Well, it's interesting. I considered that um, in the past, actually part of Fury Road, but then the science doesn't hold up. I mean, you've got to understand that the Mad Max movies evolved with culture. I mean, the first Mad Max um, basically started out of, well, without going into the details on it, it started out of my interest uh, in action chase movies, which I claim were pure cinema. That's where the language was discovered pre-sound, where you could do stuff on the screen that you couldn't experience in the theatre, you couldn't experience in a sporting arena. It was stuff that only could be put together, like the Buster Keaton, the Harold Lloyd, and so on, could only experience in the cinema in the way that the action was done and the way the syntax developed. So that was one thing. Second thing is dealing with the nature of, of, of how we deal with violence and so on. Mainly because I was experiencing it at the time being a doctor in emergency in a big city hospital, and the interesting thing about it was we didn't have the budget to make it in the present day. We couldn't block off streets. We couldn't fill it with fill the busy streets with extras like French Connection and those kind of movies which inspired, beautifully made movies and so on. We couldn't do that. So it occurred to me, if we made it a few years from now and made it dystopian, we could use rundown buildings which would cost us nothing. We could take empty back streets and so on, and we had to shoot it within 30 miles of the centre of the city of Melbourne. So we didn't have to put our cast and crew in hotels and so on. All those things were fed into Mad Max 1. Mad Max 2 came out of something completely differently. I was much more aware. I couldn't understand why Mad Max was such a success in many countries, and that led me to understand. Wait a minute, it wasn't because I was a particularly clever filmmaker. It was because unconsciously Max was an archetype, a Joseph Campbell-like archetype, and that led to Mad Max 2, where it was much more conscious. I mean, he was a kind of a Western hero. The French called the movie, this is Road Warrior, they called it a Western on wheels. It fell into all those tropes and so on. Much aware of it, but it came very, very clearly out of the oil crisis in the 70s. A city like Melbourne, Australia, a beautiful, very easygoing city, where there was no gas at the gas stations. There was one gas station that was allowing emergency workers, doctors, nurses, first responders to get gas. There were massive queues around the block. And it took 10 days for the first shot to be fired in anger. Someone fired a gun in the air because someone got and we don't have guns in Australia to the extent that you do in the United States. And I thought, wait a minute, if that's happened in 10 days, no one was hurt. I know there were fights. What happens if it's 100 days? What's happened if it's 10 years? And that led to Mad Max 2. Mad Max 3, I wasn't, I mean, there was talk of climate change, but I didn't really think about it. I just loved the image of Sydney being a city that was that you know, a great city. The only really iconic thing we have in the city is the Opera House. So the image of the Opera House now still standing, but the place is dried out. That was the image. I didn't think of the science behind it. It seems as though that there's going to be global warming, and already we're seeing the sea rising. We're much more aware of it in Australia because most of the population lives on the coast, and so anyway, the point being, I don't think the way things are going, it's going to be a question of the world drying. However, there are places in the world where the lack of rain, like lakes high up, there are places in the world where you do see the the skeletons of ships, lying on in dry sand, and so on. And there was going to be in Fury Road, way out in the desert, off in the distance, we were going to put a big ship, which was going to be just the carcass of the ship, and the idea was, you just saw it in passing, and they glimpsed out at it. And I remember we did just a very, very preliminary CG, and I thought it sort of overegged the pudding. It was interesting in that you might say, you might be interested, for instance, if it was a game, to go out and visit that and see who inhabited that place. But it's kind of distracted from the movie. It was getting into the third act, and it distracted me. So my answer is, I don't think the science holds up that the oceans, particularly Sydney Harbour, will dry. It's more likely the other way, unless global warming gets so bad that the water evaporates. But it's got to go somewhere, so it has to be there. Anyway, that's a long answer, but that. So I don't know. I don't know. He won't be going. Even though it's a great image, dry coral reefs, I don't think he'll be going past it. But you never know. I mean, yeah. I might be sitting there trying to figure something out and say, "Oh, a dry coral reef."
I can understand wanting to stick with the visual aesthetic that you've established, because despite our conversation on the podcast about, if you go 7 miles a day for 160 days, you can go from Alice Springs to like Taiwan or something like that. Yes. I don't think I could necessarily imagine a Mad Max set somewhere that's not on Australia. Like, I know you filmed in Namibia, but the setting is still very much focused on Australia.
Yes, exactly. I mean, interestingly enough, in Thunderdome, we shot in what is a dried seabed, but it's in the centre of Australia. There was a Central Australian sea, I don't know how many millennia ago, but that was... and it's a scene where you could see cars come off a small plateau. That was a small island in what was a sea. But again, that's not to do with environmental change. It's to do with geological change that it happened. I cannot remember, but I'm thinking well before man existed on the planet, and it was basically the big continental shifts over time and so on. So it's possible, but but not at the moment.
Is there any locations in Australia that you've had on your wish list to go visit and shoot some scenes in that you haven't gotten to yet?
Well, they're not sort of a wish list, but on Thunderdome, we wanted to shoot the canyon, the so-called crack in the earth where the kids were, in a place called Catajuta. It's near Uluru, once known as Ayers Rock in the centre. and they're beautiful sort of rock formations. And we wanted to shoot there. A wonderful location manager, George Mannix, went out there with our storyboards and spoke to the Indigenous elders, and he told them the story, showing our storyboards. And at the end of it, they got up. Most of them weren't English speaking. They got up and they did a dance for him in exchange for the story he told them.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, yes, you can come here. And I remember two things that they said. He asked, thank you. Why? He said, because your story reminds us of some of our stories, and the other thing they said was, think of this place like you do a cathedral or a great place of worship. And it was interesting because I didn't really understand it at the time. But we could not have menstruating women go in there. There was some deep atavistic sort of social or religious belief that you see now in modern cultures where men and women are segregated. And this is the interesting thing about Indigenous culture in Australia. It's the longest extant culture, continuous culture, even though, a lot of it's being retrieved. And that was really interesting because I somehow thought that was that wasn't the case so much in Indigenous culture. Anyway, we ended up not shooting there, not for that reason, but because it became too technically difficult. It's a very fragile desert, and it meant that all the vehicles had to be vacuumed, so that all the mud and anything caught up in the wheels, any foreign seed that came in, could really interrupt the desert. Even the cuffs of your trousers, when they had trouser cuffs, they had to be vacuumed, so you didn't have any, small seeds or whatever that could basically weed out the place and destroy the ecology of it. So we said, oh, that's just way too much. And then just when we were about to make that decision, I remember this was way back in the 80s. McDonald's made a commercial where they flew over the rock domes and then it dissolved to a Big Mac. And they and it was just so sort of lacking in respect that we said, no, we're not going to go in there and do the story. All those things combined for us never shooting there. And I don't have a scene, in mind to do there. But I would have loved to have shot that. It's so beautiful. It's quite the red that changes colour with the sun. It's you are in obviously a very ancient place that has a lot of meaning to the people that are there.
Yeah, you've really worked with some amazing cinematographers and got some breathtaking shots across the entire series. Even back in the late 70s when you were working on that first one, you've been working with so many people and directing them in such a way that's just, I can only imagine how it would have looked if you'd been able to get around the logistics, because it sounded really complicated to go out that way.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's weighed really heavily on us throughout the entire series is how oftentimes the casts that you're working with are fairly small and a lot of them get names, but right with the first movie, a couple of people stood out. Like you had Kim Sullivan as the girl in the Chevy and Kathleen McKay in the second movie as just labeled as, victim and things like that. And it really stood out to us in the fourth movie with all of the Vuvolini just being caught underneath one umbrella. And I have to wonder, is that a side effect of having to work within a 90 to 120 minute frame that you're not able to do all of those side things where, okay, this is this person, and everybody gets a proper name?
It's interesting. Going back to the first Mad Max, and I think Kim Sullivan, who was the girl who was apparently raped when the car was smashed up, and I think she was called Girl in Chevy. Or
Yeah, that's what
and,
my notes say, at least.
yeah, and then in Mad Max 2, Max and the Jorek captain look through binoculars and telescope and watch as a couple, their car gets rolled, trying to escape the compound. Uh, uh, as a car rolls, and then we watch through the telescope as she gets raped and killed, and she's just called victim. And thinking back on it at the time, there was, well, two things. I remember reading the screenplays that Walter Hill famously wrote. He called it haiku screenwriting, and I always admired screenplays that basically were very, very minimalist and got they sort of reflected what the movies do. Big elaborate descriptions are very hard to read in a screenplay because in a movie they're apparent. Anyway, so there are many characters. You don't call characters by in that more extreme world by the name. They can't be called Sam and John and Mary. They are designated by what they do.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, looking back on it. You ask a question. It's probably treating them as casually as and maybe as disrespectfully as the characters in the movies do. But with the Vulvellini and the five brides in Fury Road, we gave them. They all had names, but they weren't. I mean, and Herod wasn't just Anne Herod. Almost in a medieval way, because it's sort of forward to the past. We go back, even though it's in a dystopian future, we go back to very, very elemental behaviours that you might have got in past times, so medieval times. So people are designated apart. So she's called Anne Herod the Splendid, or Toast the Knowing. And then, with the Vulvellini, they had names as well, and I think most of the key ones are credited, like the Keeper of the Seeds, and so on. I think going to your larger question is how can you fill out? Are you asking should we given more backstory in the telling of the film than we did? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I just can't help but wonder, like, if you weren't constrained by the 2-hour runtime, for example, with Fury Road, I guess this is kind of pinwheeling off into a sixth question I wrote after I was talking to Rachel, but there's so much depth to these worlds that you create. If you were, say, approached by an HBO or Amazon or Disney Plus and said, make a 10-hour epic instead of a 2-hour movie, like, would you then be able to pour all of those ideas and realize them, take all of the work, and then put it on the screen?
Look, the answer is yes, because it's long form, but it's also no. When you take it's a really interesting question to explore, because it really goes to what the nature of film is, and film is like music. It's basically, I won't say constrained by time, but it's dictated to by time. It's in a sense tyrannized by time. Film is linear in terms of the movie moves at 24 frames a second or 25 or 60 frames a second, whatever, however many frames, but and a second is finite. And we measure time very, like, ridiculously, specifically through nuclear clocks and so on. So you have to work within that constraint in the same way you do music. I mean, if someone's playing any kind of music and in the middle of it we stop and say, do you realize that chord is such and such a chord, and go back into the history of that chord and what it meant and when it was used in certain types of music and songs, and it was once called the devil's chord, or you go back into the hypertext, as it were, and go down and look at it. You can't do that. I mean, you can, but it's not going to sweep the audience along in the experience. Right. It might be a really great lecture for musicologists or people studying music. It's the same thing with film. You don't have that. However, it's really, really important that you do all that work, all that subtext, all that backstory on the characters, because if it's not there, the audience is not going to be persuaded by your film or the story you're telling. If it's just going to be surface, you'll get that sense that, oh, those characters just came out of their trailers and they came on set and they rehearsed something and then it was basically shot. And that costume they're wearing and those objects they're holding were basically designed on paper by very talented concept artists, and they got them, but no one really knows what the function is, and they didn't grow up organically. So we had to take a very anthropological approach to particularly to Fury Road. We had to understand where everything came from, every vehicle. There had to be a backstory to it, and mainly for it to be designed. But look, for instance, if you watched a documentary on some remote culture, you're going to see a lot of stuff in that documentary, unless it's a very, very detailed study of a particular culture where every artifact is somehow basically scientifically assessed and so on. That's going to be fairly dry. But if you watch those documentaries, you're going to see behaviour of say some indigenous African tribe, and you'll see incredible costumes and weapons and so on, and you'll see rituals that you won't understand, but you know that the people in that documentary know they're deeply steeped in it. It's a long tradition and it's evolved over time. We had to take the same approach on Fury Road. It's not important that I know what the spraying of the silver, the chrome on someone's teeth is, but it's important that the actors know that Nicholas Hoult knew what that meant.
Yeah, and
he had to have his own. I've got my theories about it, but it's not important that I do. But they had to for the film to be convincing. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. I love the idea that filmmaking is analogous to a song. Like, you take something that is universally beloved, like Journey's Don't Stop Believin'. If you stop in that first line and explain that, well, South Detroit is technically in Canada and all this other stuff, it ruins the tempo.
Okay, yeah. Well, look, I think this is what I'm trying to say. This is what was so confirming or reaffirming about this experience with Fury Road, the very thing that I was trying to talk about earlier. there is a poetic dimension to it. That, and it sort of tested the theory. The whole idea of Fury Road was to tell basically a very linear 2-hour chase, as people often describe it as a U-turn, going back and going out, not finding what you're meant to, and having to go back to the place where you started at, and hopefully find a new dispensation when you create a new dispensation. Now, and it had to be on the run, and the whole exercise was about how to try to understand how much people could pick up on the run, how much of the story of the characters, and trust the audience to be reading it as accurately as possible and taking what they needed to know. A more traditional way would have been to have long expository scenes talking about and so on, but they're not inherently dramatic. The music doesn't carry you along. The progression of notes and chords and so on. The visual language doesn't carry you along. So, which means that you're relying on the poetic dimension, that something is offered up, and you as a member of the audience just naturally are interpreting according to your own worldview. And going back to someone, I'm not sure if I get the quote right, but someone asked Freddie Mercury about the meaning of Bohemian Rhapsody, the song, and they put forward their theory, and he said, "If you see it, dear, it's there." In other words, it's up to your interpretation. You know, the actors playing the characters, the world we created, have their own way of understanding. It probably coincides with the way I understand it, but also the audience is invited to make those associations, and the resonances are there. And I must say, I think that it is. I think the theory sort of worked, that people could pick up all the analogy and so on. Look, I often say you're looking for as much iceberg under the tip as possible. If you're just looking at the tip of the iceberg, you pretty soon forget it. It can be quite dazzling material, but if it doesn't have all that subtext roiling underneath and inviting you to sort of recognize it from your own observations of the world. You know, when someone has water, for instance, and the immortal Joe lets the wretched below have the water for a short time just to give them a taste, that's basically pretty clear analogy to anyone in a dominance hierarchy who controls resources. Whether and we see it right through history, and we see it today in virtually every so-called democracy. Now, and it's not something that is sort of made up. It basically arises from the world around us. So I was in India in about, actually, because Fury Road fell down a couple of times. We were going to do it in way back in 2001. 9/11 happened. It went down. I went up to the Happy Feet movies and so on. Kept going. But halfway through that, in about 2007, I remember being in India and seeing that lake. That lake hotel. Gosh, I can't remember exactly where it is now, but it was completely dry. And the elephants were in the bottom of the lake, and kids were playing soccer at the bottom of the lake. And I remember talking to this guy, and he said, yes, up in Kashmir, we're fighting the water wars. It looks like a an ideological war between Pakistan and India, but basically we're fighting the water wars. And the moment I heard that, I changed the story to be water.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the meantime, in this very state, in Australia, you got to remember Australia is essentially a desert in the centre. It's not sand dunes, all of it, but it's a fragile ecology, and and politically, we are fighting water wars. There's great rivers. Basically, I mean, various states are fighting for irrigation rights, and now it's catastrophic. There's massive fish dying, massive loss of the fish, and the ecology is being. We are literally fighting a kind of water wars. I mean, at the time in Kashmir, they were shooting each other. In Australia, it's a lot of angry political discussion about what we're doing to this fairly fragile ecology, and it's very ideological. It's really coming back to bite us in the bum, as I say. It really is. Yeah. So those sort of things you can read into the film depending on your own sort of worldview. That's. Sorry for my long answers, but that's what I think that you're trying to do. So it's on the run. You right. Cannot. Now, I'd love to do a movie where you could actually stop and discuss it, but it wouldn't be much of an experience.
Mm. Yeah. Now, spiraling off of the idea that there is so much underneath the surface, the idea of the iceberg, I've heard talk about a, quote, Mad Max Bible, not the YouTube page that I know we've talked about on the podcast, but an actual 300-page concept art and production book that exists somewhere. And I know we've got the amazing materials from Abby Bernstein's The Art of Mad Max Fury Road, and we've got Mark Sexton's comic books. But do you ever foresee a time where you will take all of that production stuff and release it more to the public, or is that just your safeguarded secrets?
It's not secret. I don't think it exists, but it exists in such a chaotic, random form that I don't think it would have much meaning. For instance, it's there's mood books, as they call them, just references of what the war boys might be having. It might have pictures of people who might have scarification, because Nux had scarifications on his body, people who paint themselves in white, all that sort of reference, all different weaponry across from medieval times and so on, all sorts of images of cars. I mean, one of the things we did with the cars, for instance, vehicles now, the modern vehicles that we have, which depend on all sorts of technologies that are too sophisticated, particularly computer technologies, they would not survive.
No.
They wouldn't. So they had to go to something much more, much more mechanical, something that somebody would who has basic mechanical skill could. Your survival depends on keeping that sort of kind of thing going. So the cars we went to were those that had hard bodies. There was no crumpled technology. No one thought there were no seat belts. There were no airbags. They probably wouldn't work anyway, the airbags. So it went back to that other time. And there was another thing driving the aesthetic of it as well, which was very important. It was kind of, everybody in designing had to work to the sort of mantra that just because it's the wasteland it doesn't mean people can't make beautiful things.
Mm.
Now, two reasons for that. I don't think I could stand to watch a movie where everything looked like a random junkyard. But it's not how human behaviour works anyway. Even in or every case where people have limited resources, early early man doing cave paintings. We're just taking different colour rocks and doing work. If you go to refugee camps, they're not junkyards. Inside those tents, they make they find bits and pieces and turn it into the most beautiful thing. If you go to, I've been to villages in Africa where they just take fence wire and make it into the most beautiful toys like motorbikes and things. Someone gave me a rose from Africa, a bunch of 3 roses from Africa, and the petals were made of shaped from Coca-Cola cans, and the stems were barbed wire,
Yeah.
and they were exquisite.
Wow.
The repurposing of objects also requires some strong aesthetic. That was another thing that drove Fury Road, and I was much more aware of that on Fury Road than I was on the other movies.
Hmm. I think it's pretty safe to say that when you look at the entire post-apocalyptic genre, that a lot of people have, I'm not going to say stolen wholesale, but paid veiled homage to the production design of Road Warrior. Does that feel a little gratifying to know that people have latched on to that idea and that,
Well,
were helped make that possible?
Sorry, what was the last thing you said?
I was just saying, is it a little gratifying to know that you pretty much made that possible?
Well, it is in the sense that it proves that there was some accuracy to it, that that sort of so-called poetic dimension I'm talking to you was rooted in something. It seemed to have a resonance. It seemed to be interpreted properly, and so yes, that's always a good feeling. I think it's really it yeah, particularly I see it in games and I also in graphic novels, which I sort of always love to see. So to the extent that people, were able to enjoy that and saw some sort of meaning into it, that is very gratifying, of course. And look, a film doesn't exist in isolation. It's very much in its historical context. I keep on saying to people, look, what worked 20 years ago, or what worked 10 years ago, it might have been brilliant back then, but is now at risk of being cliche. You must be aware that we are collectively in a process of cultural evolution, and unless you recognise that in your work, it's likely to be sort of static. It's like now. That's not to say that something can't be retrograde and make a virtue of it, but you've got to be really aware of it. One of the big things when we did Fury Road, there was a lot of pressure, not only even from people working around me, to make it kind of hark back to the early movies too much. Basically, be remakes of them. And I knew that if we did that, we would be doomed. I mean, and not only that, me personally, there's no point in doing that. It's harking back to the past. There has to be an advancement. Now, the difference between what happened back 30 years ago and what happened, when we were shooting Fury Road was enormous. Everything had changed. The the audiences had changed, meaning that I said earlier, we speed read movies. We definitely can. We see much more moving image in our lives from when we're young. We really can grab onto things much more quickly than we could have. So the way we read movies, the way the technology had changed to such a phenomenal degree. It was astonishing. So to be able to take, look, on the simplest thing, when we did it, I remember when we did explosions on Mad Max 1, we had really big reels of film. We had to have a 2,000 foot of celluloid. I don't know, I should know this now, but just say it gives you 10 minutes. It gives you 10 minutes for explosion. And but you're shooting it at slow motion. So let's say you're shooting at 96 frames a second. Now it gives you very little time to start the camera and then get whoever started the camera out of shot and to safety before you activate, the explosion. Now, that sounds okay, that's doable, but that's a major logistical problem.
Yeah.
And and if anything gets interrupted, one of your key cameras could run out of celluloid just as the explosion's happening or before. That's all gone now, because if you're shooting digitally, you can run your camera, you can just turn it on, and you've got 45 minutes at least before you have to think about changing the card. So it's even something as simple as that was a big deal. The other thing is you can put your actors in harm's way, supposedly, because you had them always on cables. Very, very easy to erase. And even simpler than that, I always used to watch action movies, even when I was young, as a kid, and I always used to notice the number of tire tracks. When they do about 3 or 4 takes of a car doing a U-turn, a skid turn, and so on, and you can tell how many takes they do. Now, shooting in the desert, in the sand, we could have had just endless tire tracks, but we were able to erase anything that wasn't necessary. Now, in the past, you would have had to stop. You would have had to either move to the side of where you did that first shot, or the second take, each subsequent take, or you had to sort of drag, big sort of bags of stuff to sort of smooth it out for your next take. Nowadays, you just shoot again, and so all of that made a huge difference. We were able to do things. Just one other example. On Thunderdome, there was a dust storm. We were shooting out at a place called Cooper Pedy. And they come along, quite rarely, one of those massive dust storms. And I remember we looked up and it was coming. And I remember saying, look, can we take the plane up and fly, don't fly into it because you know what's going to happen, but fly on the edge of it. And we did, and we shot that sequence. Now we had a dust storm, in Fury Road, where we could do whatever we wanted. We wanted. We didn't have to wait, and then we didn't. It wasn't even written in the script. We just saw it coming, and decided to do it. So filmmaking had changed enormously, and the culture had changed, and the way we read films. So this film had to, in some way, take all of that into account. Anyway, I'm raving on now. Ask me another question.
Yeah, it's funny to think about the changes because you think back to Road Warrior, and you've got that Virginia Hay shaped dummy that gets sucked underneath the wheels as she's
Yeah.
hanging off. And then in Fury Road, you've got your stuntman leaping off the back of the tanker, and you see the behind the scenes pictures. You've got the gimbal and all the wires, and you just paint off all of that. And
Yes,
it's
yes,
mind blowing to see the difference.
yes. Oh, yeah, that way. I always thought when you see that dummy, it looks like a dummy, doesn't it?
It's a little floppy.
Sorry, yeah, and just the way the legs were and so on. And it wasn't even didn't even have the correct body weight. But I will tell you on Fury Road, I remember talking to Guy Norris, the second unit director, and the Stucco and the special effect crew. And I said, let's make up some dummies, but let's give them the correct body weight and give them a kind of we put kind of elastic cord so that even their arms and so on would move with some sort of that more natural resistance. And I said, let's put them in, whenever there's something going on, let's put them in. And if they don't work and if they look like dummy, like for instance, Virginia Hayes dummy, then we can erase them and we could put, we could comp in someone else doing something. Now, in two of those cases, it really pulled off, and it really worked. I don't know if you remember, there was a thing called the excavator where we had that big backhoe on, whatever. When that falls, we put one of the characters, that was a dummy that flies through the air. He was put on with Velcro, and as it flipped, the Velcro released and he flew through the air. And that was because he was exactly a normal human body weight. And so it behaved naturalistically enough where we didn't have to do anything to it, except when after it hit the ground, the way it sort of rolled, it was clearly, it just didn't look. So we only took a few frames up as it hit the ground. So again, we still were using old school methods to make it work. So.
Man. I will admit, I did not realize that the war boy flying through, getting launched off the excavator arm, that it was a life dummy. I thought it was just like a composite or something like that.
No,
it's amazing.
Yeah. So that was me learning from all those years before.
Yeah. Do you think doing those animated movies, the Happy Feet movies, between Thunderdome and Fury Road, do you think that really expanded your idea of what a computer could do?
Oh yeah. Since the advent of sound, the digital dispensation has been the most significant thing that's happened to cinema, because it makes it so much more malleable, much more plastic. Before, basically, you could only you couldn't do much between the cuts. But now you can actually take the frames and play a lot more with it. And I learned that from, I was always interested in what technology could do. It was one of the things that helped drive the story. The first Babe movie, it took us a long time to have the ability to simply make an animal talk. I mean, there were animatronics, but to make them talk in a way that was convincing enough, we had to, that was just at the beginning of people using CGI for movies. And by the way, Andrew Leslie, who shot that movie, went on to shoot The Lord of the Rings. And I remember he came back from the first Lord of the Rings and showed me the first motion capture with Gollum, Andy Serkis and Gollum. Mm-hmm. And And I'd had the story of Happy Feet, and the moment I saw that, I said, we can make the penguins dance. We couldn't, you can't, a dancer, a tap dancer particularly, spends a whole lifetime developing the neurology and the muscle memory, whatever you call it, to be able to tap dance like that. No matter how good an animator might be, they can never achieve that. But we could motion capture it, and suddenly, so that sort of stuff was really valuable. And so you get a kind of, you get comfortable with what the technology can do. But probably the most important thing was the notion, it proved the notion that there is only one perfect place for the camera at any given time in a movie. It was really interesting to me that you could take, say, a scene from Happy Feet, and just by changing the camera, the angle of the camera and the cutting pattern, you had exactly the same performance, exactly the same lighting. You had everything precisely the same, but depending on where you put the camera after the event, you could change the whole tone of the scene. And I learned that I proved that for myself on Happy Feet, because I'd take a scene and it wasn't very expensive to move the camera or to change the cut. It's just sitting, with a friend in front of a computer. There's only basically two of you, and then rendering it out. And it was quite striking. So by the time we got back to Fury Road, I was just very, very aware of how careful you had to be with where the camera was. But you can't just put a lot of random cameras on something and hope that you'll find it in the cut. There has to be a very, very strong causality, one shot to the other. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to get it right every time. And there's so much, particularly with Fury Road, there was so much work to do post, in the editing. It was I always had this image of this movie being like a massive Rubik cube, as big as one of those gym balls, those big plastic, the big bouncy balls you get in the gym.
Yeah.
I imagine a Rubik's cube with thousands of times, and that big. That's how I have these little fantasies. That's what the movie's doing it. And that's what cutting was like. And I'm just so grateful to Margaret, my partner Margaret Cecil, because she just had the brain power to do it. I don't know how. Have you ever done a Rubik's cube?
I have in the past. I know that there's a trick to it, but I've never mastered it.
Okay. All right. I've tried it. So yeah. Look, the animations taught me a lot. Look, I think with animation is you can think everything through. It's like extreme slow motion live action filmmaking, but you've got time to think a lot more than you do on the set. When you're shooting live action, particularly, I'm sure it's like any kind of film, it's a little bit like being a basketball player and so on. You've done all the drilling, you've practiced, you've really honed all, you've taken your basic talent and really drilled it. But during the game, whatever the game plan is, in the moment, you haven't. It's purely reflex response. You don't have time to think, should I do this or should I do that? You just work out of the intuitive reflex response. And I think it's a little bit like that with live action on the set. You don't have time to sit and consider anything. You've just got to go off out of your gut feeling. How do we adjust that performance? How do we do that? Where do we put the camera and so on? Despite all the planning. So that's the big that's also the biggest difference between animation and live action.
Now, there's been, now Julie and I have discussed specifically in one of the recent episodes that we dropped, are questioning whether like Max has a shelf life as a character, or like can he just exist indefinitely? Like there was talk about how back when Mel was on board to do the role, the idea that at the end of the story he would, find solace, he would, settle down. And then when we brought in, or when you brought in Tom, that at the end of that movie he wanders back out into the wasteland. Do you think Max can just exist indefinitely? Do you think you'll ever foresee him settling down?
Well, you obviously think about the characters and what might happen to them. But this film, I mean, obviously can't be chronological. He's an archetype. He's not way back from the beginning. When it was first shown in Japan, they saw him as a wandering samurai. In Scandinavia, they saw him as a lone Viking wandering the landscape, and the French were those that said were the first to say that these are Western on wheels. So you've got that Western archetypal. It's a very very reduced world. It's a world that's very somehow, but elemental is the word. They become very elemental words where you can play out this story. So because the 4 films were never conceived as a continuous saga, I think the answer is that he's wandering the wasteland. There's not a chronological narrative to his life. In a sense, there can't be. Had Mel played the character, he was 21 when he played the first one, and had he played the character, he's obviously an older man. Now, the story was never accounting for that. There were no lines like, what was it from Lethal Weapon? I'm too old for this stuff.
Yeah.
There was never anything like that. He was just the character. But as it got delayed, I mean, God, it got delayed so many times that it got to the point. Plus, Mel was having a lot of turbulence in his life, and even publicly and physically, it wasn't going to. They were tough movies. Tom Hardy is extremely athletic. He's one of those people with really quick reflexes, like really quick. Like, you do those tricks where you hold a note and you try to drop it through the fingers. He could do that. Mel Gibson actually had that too. He was very, very quick. But like a lot of athletes do it. And Tom had that, a lot of agility and stuff, which was necessary. So look, the answer is he goes on. I guess a little bit like the James Bond movies. I mean, whoever plays him doesn't age within the stories. The world changes according to the times, but the basic characters are the same. Yeah.
It's nice to think that Max can just exist as an element of the wasteland. Like, he's not, like, yes, he is a man, but he's not just a man. He's more of an idea.
Yeah, that's. I've never thought of it that way, but that's emerging. Many people are sort of choosing to see it that way, and I must say it makes sense to me.
Yeah, it reminds me of the advertisements, I think, for the first movie, where the voiceover would say, "Pray he's out there somewhere." And if Max is just out there wandering the wasteland, you can count on him always being somewhere out there.
Yeah.
Now, obviously Max wasn't the only star of the movie. People love Furiosa, and I think there was also some discussion about the possibility of her getting more stories. When you think about the Mad Max series, would you ever consider like doing Star Wars style spin-offs where you've got Furiosa, a Mad Max story?
Well, look, it's something that you find yourself thinking about automatically. I'm not thinking strategically about let's do a spin-off or anything like that.
Yeah.
But what happens, and it, what happens is that without you having really much control over it, the characters are there in your head, or they, and I'm sure this happens a lot of times.
Mm.
And the reason why why it happens with Mad Max is that they're allegorical.
Mm.
They basically, as I said before, you're basically going forward to the past, but really it's about the present. In other words, you go, for people who, and I know it's come up several times in your podcast about what's the timeline of Mad Max. This is without trying to look at all the films. This is the basic way I've looked at the film. I said, imagine next Wednesday all the bad things you probably heard me. You know, or I probably said this before, so I'll say it again as if I'm saying it for the first time. Okay. So basically what I say to myself is, or I say to everybody, is imagine next Wednesday that all the bad things that you see in the news come to pass all at once. So you get financial crisis, you get the power grid goes down, you get the climate catastrophe, a distant nuclear skirmish somewhere. All of these things happen all at once. And you just have to start from that moment. What would you do? What would actually happen? What would be the first thing that you would do when you couldn't get refrigeration? How would you keep your family and loved ones alive? What would you do? Who would be more likely to survive? What skills you have? You start with that. And I say, you go, like for Fury, it's about that having happened, you go forward to about 45 years into the future, and you basically try to track the whole thing, like every character with that sort of backstory in mind. The interesting thing that happens, and this is why this is a long explanation as to what's happening in terms of where it might go. Basically what happens is you go into the post-apocalyptic world, 45 years in the future, but you go back to two basic things, the kind of pretty much universal behavior that goes back, human behavior that goes back in time, back to, way back to the Bronze Age or even earlier, where the behaviors tend to be the same, where the dominance hierarchies have always somebody on the top, sitting on the top, controlling the resources, usually in a way that basically appropriates religious belief to create a cult. And even the architecture is almost always the same. Citadels where gravity basically is your competitive advantage, so you go back to the past, but really it's about the present. And here's my point. So you're watching the world around you, and you see behaviors, and you say to yourself, okay, oh, that's really interesting that's happening now. That reminds me of that historical event way back in time. The kind of behaviors we're seeing now haven't really changed, despite our sense of the world. Technologically we're advancing. We've got much more privilege than we had in the past compared to what we, just look at medically in the Western world. I mean, most of us would be dead now. A huge number of people would be dead now just for the want of antibiotics.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times have you had an infection or poisoning when you were a child? I had blood poisoning. I would have been gone in the past, but I'm treated within, when I was a kid, I was treated, within days I was back on my feet. In the past, I would have been like it just. So there are advantages. Okay, so what's happening? It's very, very hard not to think of these stories because they're very seductive. It's a way of looking at the world, comparing it to the past, and having characters which give you a portal into that world. Because that's why we tell stories. They are a way of making a chaotic world more coherent. The randomness. So someone like a Furiosa or a Max or any of these characters.
Sorry, it took critiques here in about 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. We've got about 15 minutes. Is that okay, Rick?
Yeah. We can start wrapping up. I don't want to keep you.
Yeah. If you want to do more, because you guys have been so thorough, I'm happy to do it some other time. Just so that you know.
Exactly.
Okay.
We've had an amazing discussion today. Like we've been going for over an hour here. And
okay.
I just
you cut all this up.
Oh yeah, I will do my due diligence to organize this the best way I can.
So my answer is it's hard not to think of those characters, but I'm not thinking of terms. Oh, let's do a spin-off or anything. It's just I've described it as very Darwinian. There's all this stuff banging around in your head, and there's some of the stories are way more insistent than others, and the reason being is because they have more resonance. They have more iceberg under the tip than others. They tick more boxes. They seem to conform more to my sort of groping for understanding about what story is about.
Yeah.
It's not really how to tell stories. It's why do we tell each other stories? What's the purpose of story? Which is basically the fundamental question of my life, and I think ultimately most of our lives. We make the world coherent by the narratives. You explain your lives and everybody in your life in terms of the stories you tell about them. At birthday parties, at funerals, at weddings, it's all stories, and some of them are epic stories. The story of science, the narrative of human science is a phenomenal story. I mean, 20th century physics. We are talking now because of Newton and Einstein.
Yeah.
And it's real time. And you're on the other side of the world from me. and now that narrative is probably the greatest creative achievement of humankind. Anyway, I don't. As you can tell, I give very, very long elliptical answers.
Yeah. Well, the way I see it, you've got all of these different stories to tell, and if time ever becomes a crunch, you can always go over to Mark Sexton's desk and slap down a story and say, write another comic so Rick can read it.
Yes. Well, Mark, Mark is very impressive because I don't know if you know, but he started off as a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got that creativity with that very, very rigorous scientific mind. He's able to do it. He's the one who sort of keeps on pulling me up and saying, wait a minute, that's not consistent with this or that, because he has that rigor. Yes, and I would love to do some more comics. Actually, there's so much material there that and Mark took that on, despite having to do a lot of other things. He and Nicola Thuris, and it was really great. Yeah, so that's what I'll do actually. good idea. He's busy at the moment working on Marvel films, so
Right.
maybe when he finishes that.
Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know you've got a busy day ahead of you, but I just want to say thank you so much for sitting down with me. Thank you so much for doing everything that you do. I may not have, some sort of tribal dance to gift you with in exchange for the stories that you've told, but I guess all I have to offer is the podcast that I've done. And I'm really looking forward to what you have coming down the pike. You've got 3,000 Years of Longing that you're going to start production on in March, and then whatever else in the future. So from me to you, best of luck, break a leg. We're pulling for you over on the other side of the world. There's no other way I can put it. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Rick. At least thank Julia as well. I mean, I was, I said I was honored, but it really is because but honoured by, as I described it, the Herculean task that you guys took on to actually look at something minute by minute and really, you honoured the work. I mean, you basically really, you taught me about our own work, and that's a big thing. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, certainly, and your audience. So thank you very much. It's back at you entirely.
Yeah. Now, I'll tell you one thing: if you do end up making another Mad Max movie, that'll give us a season 5. So we're intrinsically linked at this point.
All right. Okay. All right. And then I'll get really self-conscious because what I'm saying to myself, if I do that, what will they say about it in the podcast?
All right. Well, once again, thank you so much, George. You have a lovely rest of your day.
Yeah, same to you. Thanks, Rick. Thank you.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye.